Ever wondered what life was truly like in Dickensian London? From the poignant plight of orphans to the triumphant spirit of redemption, Dickens' narratives pulse with the heartbeat of humanity. But it's not just his tales that captivate, it's the man behind the pen. Join us as we unravel the enigmatic life of Dickens himself, from his humble beginnings to his meteoric rise as a literary luminary. Charles John Huffam Dickens, February 7, 1812 to June 9, 1870, was an English author and social commentator who created some of the world's most famous fictional characters. He is often regarded as the finest novelist of the Victorian era. During his lifetime, his works achieved unparalleled popularity, and by the 20th century, critics and scholars regarded him as a literary genius. His novels and short stories remain well-read today. Dickens, who was born in Portsmouth, dropped out of school at the age of 12 to work in a bootblacking factory while his father, John, was detained in a debtor's prison. After 3 years, he returned to school and began his literary career as a journalist. Dickens published a weekly magazine for 20 years, produced 15 novels, 5 novellas, hundreds of short tales, and non-fiction articles, gave numerous lectures and readings, was an untiring letter writer, and fiercely advocated for children's rights, education, and other social changes. Dickens' literary career began with the serial publication of the Pickwick Papers in 1836, a publishing phenomenon fueled partly by the introduction of the character Sam Weller in the 4th episode, which sparked Pickwick products and spin-offs. Within a few years, Dickens had become an international literary sensation, known for his wit, sarcasm, and sharp observations on character and society. His works, the majority of which were published in monthly or weekly installments, pioneered the serial distribution of narrative fiction, which eventually became the dominant Victorian novel publication form. Cliffhanger endings in his serial releases kept readers on edge. The installment style allowed Dickens to gauge his audience's reaction, and he frequently changed his plot and character development depending on that feedback. For example, when his wife's chiropodist voiced concern about how Miss Mosher in David Copperfield appeared to represent her own limitations, Dickens enhanced the character with positive characteristics. His plots were well crafted, and he frequently included themes from current events into his stories. Masses of illiterate poor would pay a halfpenny each to have each new monthly episode read to them, introducing and motivating a new generation of readers. His 1843 novella A Christmas Carol remains exceptionally popular, inspiring adaptations in every creative field. Oliver Twist and Great Expectations are other popular adaptations, and like many of his writings, they evoke visions of early Victorian London. His most well-known historical novel is A Tale of Two Cities, 1859, which is set in London and Paris. In answer to public demand, the most recognized celebrity of his era embarked on a series of public reading tours later in his career. The adjective Dickensian refers to anything that is evocative of Dickens and his novels, such as bad social or working conditions or delightfully disgusting individuals. Early life. Charles Dickens was born on February 7, 1812, at 1 Mile End Terrace, now 393 Commercial Road, Landport, Portsea Island, Portsmouth, Hampshire, as the second of 8 children of Elizabeth Dickens, née Barrow, 1789 to 1863, and John Dickens, 1785 to 1851. His father worked as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office and was briefly stationed in the district. He asked Christopher Huffam, a rigger in His Majesty's Navy, a gentleman, and the leader of an established enterprise, to serve as Charles's godfather. Huffam is said to have inspired Paul Dombey, the proprietor of a shipping concern in Dickens' novel Dombey and Son, 1848. In January 1815, John Dickens was summoned back to London, and the family relocated to Norfolk Street in Fitzrovia. When Charles was 4 years old, his family relocated to Sheerness, then to Chatham, Kent, where he spent his formative years until the age of 11. His early childhood appears to have been pleasant, albeit he considered himself a very small and not over-particularly taken care of boy. Charles enjoyed spending time outside, but he also read a lot, especially Tobias Smollett and Henry Fielding's picaresque works, as well as Robinson Crusoe and Gil Blas. He read and reread the Arabian Nights and the collected farces of Elizabeth Inchbald. At the age of 7, he witnessed Joseph Grimaldi, the pioneer of modern clowning, perform at the Star Theatre in Rochester, Kentucky. He later replicated Grimaldi's clowning on numerous occasions and edited Joseph Grimaldi's memoirs. He had vivid memories of his boyhood, aided by an excellent recall of people and events that he employed in his work. His father's brief stint as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office provided him with a few years of private schooling, first at a Dame school and later at a dissenting school in Chatham managed by William Giles. This era came to an end in June 1822, when John Dickens was summoned to Navy Pay Office headquarters at Somerset House, and the family, except for Charles, who stayed behind to finish his final term of school, relocated to Camden Town, London. The family had fled Kent due to fast-rising debts, and in 1824, John Dickens was driven by his creditors into the Marshalsea debtors' jail in Southwark, London. His wife and youngest children accompanied him there, as was customary at the time. Charles, then 12, boarded with Elizabeth Roylance, a family acquaintance, at 112 College Place in Camden Town. Mrs. Roylance was a reduced, impoverished old lady long known to our family, whom Dickens eventually immortalized with a few alterations and embellishments as Mrs. Pipchin in Dombey and Son. Later, he lived in a back attic in the house of Archibald Russell, an agent for the insolvent court, a fat, good-natured, kind old gentleman, with a quiet old wife and a lame son, on Lant Street in Southwark. They served as inspiration for the garlands in the old curiosity shop. On Sundays, he spent the day at Marshalsea with his sister Frances, who was free from her studies at the Royal Academy of Music. Dickens later used the prison as the backdrop for Little Dorrit. To pay for his board and to aid his family, Dickens was compelled to leave school and work 10-hour days at Warren's blacking warehouse, on Hungerford Stairs, near the current Charing Cross railway station. He made 6 shillings per week by placing labels on pots of boot blacking. The rigorous and frequently cruel working conditions left a lasting impression on Dickens and affected his writings and essays, laying the groundwork for his interest in reforming socio-economic and labor conditions, which he considered were unfairly borne by the poor. He later said that he pondered how I could have been so easily cast away at such an age. As he remembered to John Forster, the blacking warehouse was the last property on the left side of the road, at Old Hungerford Stairs. It was a dilapidated old house next to the river, absolutely filled with rats. Its wainscoted rooms, its decaying flooring and staircase, the ancient grey rats swarming down in the cellars, the sound of their squeaking and scuffling coming up the stairs at all times, and the grime and decay of the house all spring up visibly before me, as if I were back there. The counting house located on the first story, overlooking the coal boats and the river. There was a recess in which I was supposed to sit and work. My job was to cover the paste blacking pots, first with oil paper and then with blue paper, tie them together with a string, and finally snip the paper close and neatly. Its wainscoted rooms, rotting flooring and staircase, the ancient grey rats swarming down in the cellars, the constant sound of their squeaking and scuffling coming up the stairs, and the grime and ruin of the home all appear visibly before me, as if I were back there. The counting house is placed on the first floor, overlooking the coal vessels and the river. There was a recess during which I was supposed to sit and work. My duty was to cover the paste blacking pots with oil paper and then blue paper, tie them together with a string, and then snip the paper neatly. Elizabeth Dickens, John Dickens' mother, died a few months after his imprisonment, leaving him a bequest of £450. Dickens was released from prison in hopes of leaving a legacy. Dickens and his family departed Marshalsea for Mrs. Roylance's home after arranging for payment of his creditors under the Insolvent Debtors Act. Charles's mother, Elizabeth Dickens, did not instantly agree to his transfer from the boot-blacking warehouse. This inspired Dickens' belief that a father should control the family while a woman should find her proper place within the home. I never afterwards forgot, I never shall forget, I never can forget, that my mother was warm for my being sent back. His mother's failure to request his return contributed to his dissatisfaction with women. Righteous indignation over his own situation and the conditions under which working-class people lived became major themes in his works, and it was this unhappy period in his youth to which he alluded in his favorite and most autobiographical novel, David Copperfield. I had no advice, counsel, encouragement, consolation, assistance, or support of any kind, from anyone, that I can call to mind, as I hope to go to heaven. Dickens was eventually assigned to the Wellington House Academy in Camden Town, where he remained until March 1827, having spent almost 2 years there. He did not believe it was a good school, much of the haphazard, desultory instruction, bad discipline punctuated by the headmaster's savage harshness. Mr. Creakle's establishment in David Copperfield embodies the shady ushers and general rundown environment. Dickens worked as a junior clerk at the law firm of Ellis and Blackmore, lawyers, of Holborn Court, Gray's Inn, from May 1827 to November 1828. He was a skilled mimic, impersonating clients, lawyers, and clerks. He was an avid theater-goer, claiming to have gone every day for at least 3 years straight. His favorite actor was Charles Matthews, and Dickens memorized his monologues, farces in which Matthews portrayed all of the characters. Then, after learning Gurney's shorthand system in his leisure time, he went on to become a freelance reporter. A distant relative, Thomas Charlton, was a freelance reporter at Doctors' Commons, and Dickens was able to use his box there to report on the court processes for over 4 years. This education was to inform works such as Nicholas Nickleby, Dombey and Son, and especially Bleak House, whose vivid depiction of the machinations and bureaucracy of the legal system did much to enlighten the general public and served as a vehicle for the dissemination of Dickens' own views, particularly the heavy burden on the poor who were forced by circumstance to go to law. In 1830, Dickens met his first love, Maria Beadnell, who is said to have inspired the character Dora in David Copperfield. Maria's parents disapproved of the courtship and ended it by sending her to school in Paris. Career: journalism and writing. Dickens was 20 years old in 1832, and he was full of energy and self-confidence. He appreciated mimicry and popular entertainment, lacked a strong, particular vision of who he wanted to be, and understood he desired popularity. He was drawn to the theater and became an early member of the Garrick Club. He earned an acting audition in Covent Garden, where he would be seen by manager George Bartley and actor Charles Kemble. Dickens diligently studied and intended to emulate comic Charles Matthews, but he eventually missed the audition due to a cold. He had already begun his writing career before another possibility presented itself. In 1833, Dickens sent his first story, A Dinner at Poplar Walk, to the London magazine Monthly Magazine. His uncle, William Barrow, offered him a job on the Mirror of Parliament, and he initially worked in the House of Commons in early 1832. He rented a room at Furnivall's Inn and worked as a political journalist, reporting on parliamentary debates and covering election campaigns for the Morning Chronicle. His journalism, in the form of sketches in journals, produced his first collection of articles, which was published in 1836. Boz's sketches are based on a family moniker that he used as an alias for several years. Dickens appears to have derived it from his youngest brother Augustus Dickens' moniker Moses, which was based on a character in Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield. When uttered by someone with a head cold, Moses became Bozes, eventually abbreviated to Boz. A contemporaneous reviewer regarded Dickens' own name queer and wrote in 1849, Mr. Dickens, as if in revenge for his own queer name, does bestow still queerer ones upon his fictitious creations. Dickens wrote for and edited periodicals throughout his creative career. In January 1835, the Morning Chronicle began an evening edition, edited by George Hogarth, the Chronicle's music critic. Dickens became a regular visitor to Hogarth's Fulham mansion, where he was delighted by Hogarth's connection with Walter Scott, whom Dickens greatly admired, and enjoyed the company of Hogarth's 3 daughters, Georgina, Mary, and 19-year-old Catherine. Dickens advanced rapidly, both professionally and socially. He formed a connection with William Harrison Ainsworth, the author of the Highwayman novel Rookwood, 1834, whose bachelor salon on Harrow Road had become a gathering place for a group that included Daniel Maclise, Benjamin Disraeli, Edward Bulwer-Lytton, and George Cruikshank. All of these became his friends and partners, with the exception of Disraeli. He met his first publisher, John Macroney, in the Mansion. Following the popularity of sketches by Boz, publishers Chapman and Hull proposed that Dickens produce text to accompany Robert Seymour's engraved pictures in a monthly letterpress. After the second installment, Seymour committed suicide, and Dickens, who wished to compose a connected series of sketches, engaged Phiz to provide the story's engravings, which were reduced from 4 to 2 per installment. The ensuing plot became the Pickwick Papers, and while the first few episodes were not particularly successful, the introduction of the Cockney character Sam Weller in the 4th episode, the first to be illustrated by Phiz, marked a significant increase in popularity. The final installment sold 40,000 copies. In terms of the character's significance, the Paris Review wrote, "Arguably the most historic bump in English publishing is the Sam Weller bump." John Sutherland described the Pickwick Papers as the most important single novel of the Victorian era. Pickwick cigars, playing cards, china figurines, Sam Weller puzzles, Weller boot polish, and joke books were among the many spin-offs and items created as a result of his remarkable success. The Sam Weller bump demonstrates not only Dickens' humorous talent, but also his skill as a authorpreneur, a portmanteau he used long before The Economist popularized it. Dickens was a creation of capitalism, despite having built his career crusading against the squalor of the Industrial Revolution. He exploited everything from powerful new printing presses to increased advertising revenues and railroad expansion to sell additional books. Dickens ensured that his novels were available in cheap bindings for the lower classes as well as in morocco and gilt for persons of distinction. His ideal readership comprised everyone from pickpockets who read Oliver Twist to Queen Victoria, who found it exceedingly interesting. The Atlantic's Nicholas Dames says, "Literature is not a broad enough genre for Pickwick. It created its own category, which we now refer to as entertainment." Dickens obtained the role of editor of Bentley's Miscellany in November 1836, and he held it for 3 years before falling out with the owner. In 1836, when he concluded the final installments of the Pickwick Papers, he began writing the first installments of Oliver Twist, producing up to 90 pages per month while continuing work on Bentley's and creating 4 plays, the production of which he directed. Oliver Twist, published in 1838, is one of Dickens' best-known stories and the first Victorian novel with a kid protagonist. Dickens married Catherine Thompson Hogarth, 1815 to 1879, the daughter of George Hogarth, editor of the Evening Chronicle, on April 2, 1836, following a 1-year engagement and between episodes 2 and 3 of the Pickwick Papers. They were married at St. Luke's Church in Chelsea, London. Following their brief honeymoon in Chalk, Kent, the couple returned to Furnivall's Inn. Charles, the first of their 10 children, was born in January 1837, and the family moved to Bloomsbury at 48 Doughty Street, London, where Charles had a 3-year lease at £80 per year, from March 25 to December 1839. Dickens' younger brother Frederick and Catherine's 17-year-old sister Mary Hogarth moved in with them. Dickens developed strong feelings for Mary, and she died in his arms after a brief illness in 1837. Unusually for Dickens, he stopped working as a result of his shock and spent a month with Catherine at a little farm on Hampstead Heath. Dickens idealized Mary, the figure he created after her, Rose Maylie. He discovered he could no longer kill in his fiction, as he had planned, and, according to Ackroyd, he drew on recollections of her for his later portrayals of Little Nell and Florence Dombey. His sadness was so intense that he was unable to make the deadline for the June installment of the Pickwick Papers and was forced to cancel the Oliver Twist installment that same month. Dickens and John Forster developed an unofficial commercial relationship during their stay in Hampstead, and Forster was the first to read Dickens' work. His success as a novelist continued. The youthful Queen Victoria read Oliver Twist and the Pickwick Papers and stayed up till midnight discussing them. Nicholas Nickleby, 1838-39, The Old Curiosity Shop, 1840-41, and, eventually, his first historical novel, Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80, as part of the Master Humphreys Clock series, 1840-41, were all published in monthly installments before being published as volumes. In the middle of all his activities during this time, there was dissatisfaction with his publishers, and John Macroney was paid off, while Richard Bentley signed over all rights to Oliver Twist. Other signs of restlessness and discontent surfaced. In Broadstairs, he flirted with Eleanor Picken, the young fiancée of his solicitor's best friend, and one night seized her and rushed down to the sea. He claimed that they would both perish in the sad sea waves. She finally got loose and kept her distance. In June 1841, he embarked on a 2-month tour of Scotland before telegraphing Forster in September 1841 that he had decided to travel to America. Master Humphreys Clock was shut down, but Dickens remained interested in the weekly magazine format, which he had grown to appreciate from his youth reading of 18th-century periodicals Tatler and The Spectator. Dickens was disturbed by the Tories' return to power, describing them as people whom, politically, I despise and abhor. He was inclined to run for Liberals in reading, but opted against it due to financial constraints. He penned 3 anti-Tory poetic satires for the Examiner, titled The Fine Old English Gentleman, The Quack Doctor's Proclamation, and Subjects for Painters. First visit to the United States. Dickens and his wife arrived in Boston, Massachusetts, on January 22, 1842, on the RMS Britannia on their first trip to the United States and Canada. Georgina Hogarth, Catherine's other sister, joined the Dickens family, who were now residing at Devonshire Terrace in Marylebone, to care for the young family they had abandoned. She stayed with them as a housekeeper, organizer, counsel, and friend until Dickens died in 1870. Dickens based the character of Agnes Wickfield on Georgina and Mary. He documented his experiences in a travelogue titled American Notes for General Circulation. In Notes, Dickens included a scathing criticism of slavery, which he had condemned as early as the Pickwick Papers, linking the freedom of the poor in England to the abolition of slavery overseas, citing newspaper tales of fugitive slaves mutilated by their masters. Despite the abolitionist emotions he gained during his voyage to America, some later observers have pointed out contradictions in Dickens' views on racial inequality. For example, he has been chastised for his later complicity in Governor Eyre's ruthless repression on the Morant Bay Revolt in Jamaica in the 1860s, as well as his unwillingness to criticize it alongside other British progressive leaders. Dickens returned from Richmond, Virginia, to Washington, D.C., and began his journey westward, stopping briefly in Cincinnati and Louisville before arriving in St. Louis, Missouri. While there, he stated a desire to visit an American prairie before heading east. A group of 13 men then set out with Dickens to see Looking Glass Prairie, which is 30 miles into Illinois. Dickens spent a month in New York City during his American visit, giving lectures and discussing international copyright rules as well as American piracy of his work. He persuaded a group of 25 writers, led by Washington Irving, to sign a petition for him to present to Congress, but the press was generally adverse to this, claiming that he should be glad for his popularity and that complaining about his work being pirated was mercenary. According to critic Kate Flint, his popularity caused a shift in his self-perception, as he found himself a cultural commodity, and its circulation had passed out of his control, prompting him to become interested in and delve into themes of public and personal personas in his subsequent novels. She claims that he took on the position of an influential commentator, both publicly and in his fiction, as evidenced by his subsequent publications. His vacation to the United States concluded with a stop in Canada, where he performed in light comedies in Niagara Falls, Toronto, Kingston, and Montreal. Return to England. Soon after returning to England, Dickens began writing the first of his Christmas stories, A Christmas Carol, in 1843, followed by The Chimes in 1844 and The Cricket on the Hearth in 1845. A Christmas Carol was the most popular of these, and by drawing on an old custom, it helped to rekindle enthusiasm for the delights of Christmas in Britain and America. The story's seeds were planted in Dickens' head after a visit to Manchester to observe the working conditions of the city's factories. This, combined with images he had previously experienced at the Field Lane Ragged School, inspired Dickens to strike a sledgehammer blow for the impoverished. Dickens became engaged in the book as the story's concept developed and writing began. He subsequently recalled that as the story unfolded, he wept and laughed, and wept again as he walked about the black streets of London 15 or 20 miles many a night when all sober folks had gone to bed. After a brief stay in Italy, Dickens moved to Switzerland, where he began writing on Dombey and Son. This, along with David Copperfield, 1849-50, represents an important artistic break in Dickens' career, as his books grew more serious in tone and more meticulously organized than his earlier works. Around this time, he learned of a significant embezzlement at the firm where his brother, Augustus, worked, John Chapman & Co. It was carried out by Thomas Powell, a clerk who was acquainted with Dickens and had served as Augustus' tutor when he first started work. Powell was an author and poet who knew many of the prominent writers of the time. After more fraudulent operations, Powell went to New York and released a book called The Living Authors of England, including a chapter on Charles Dickens, who was not amused by Powell's writing. One thing that seemed to irritate him was the claim that he based the character of Paul Dombey, Dombey and Son, on Thomas Chapman, one of the key partners at John Chapman and Company. Dickens promptly dispatched a letter to Lewis Gaylord Clark, editor of the New York literary magazine The Knickerbocker, accusing Powell of forgery and theft. Clark published the letter in the New York Tribune, and numerous other newspapers picked up on the story. Powell began suing these newspapers, and Clark was arrested. Dickens, knowing he had moved hastily, called John Chapman & Co. to obtain written confirmation of Powell's guilt. Dickens did receive a response confirming Powell's embezzlement, but when the directors realized this material might have to be presented in court, they refused to make any more disclosures. Because it was difficult to provide evidence to back up his charges in America, Dickens eventually reached an out-of-court deal with Powell. Philanthropy. Angela Burdett Coutts, heir to the Coutts banking fortune, approached Dickens in May 1846 about establishing a home for working-class women in need of redemption. Coutts envisioned a home that would replace existing institutions' punitive regimes with a reformative atmosphere that promoted education and proficiency in domestic household activities. After initially refusing, Dickens eventually built Urania Cottage in the Lime Grove neighborhood of Shepherd's Bush, which he supervised for 10 years, establishing house rules, examining accounts, and interviewing prospective tenants. Emigration and marriage were key to Dickens' plans for the ladies after they left Urania Cottage, from which it is estimated that approximately 100 women graduated between 1847 and 1859. Religious views. As a young man, Dickens despised certain features of organized religion. In a pamphlet titled Sunday Under Three Heads, he defended the people's right to pleasure while opposing a plan to ban games on Sundays. Take a look at your churches, they have smaller congregations and low attendance. People have become grumpy and obstinate. People are getting dissatisfied with the faith that condemns them to such a day, once every 7. They express their feelings by staying away from church. Turn into the streets, on a Sunday, and see the stiff melancholy that pervades everything around. Dickens honored the figure of Jesus Christ. He is considered a professing Christian. His son, Henry Fielding Dickens, regarded him as someone who possessed deep religious convictions. In the early 1840s, he expressed an interest in Unitarian Christianity, and Robert Browning wrote, "Mr. Dickens is an enlightened Unitarian." According to Professor Gary College, he never strayed from his attachment to popular lay Anglicanism. Dickens wrote The Life of Our Lord, 1846, a book on Christ's life, to share his faith with his children and family. In a passage from David Copperfield, Dickens replicated Geoffrey Chaucer's usage of Luke 23 verse 34 from Troilus and Chryside. Dickens kept a copy in his library, and G.K. Chesterton wrote, "Among the great canonical English authors, Chaucer and Dickens have the most in common." Dickens disapproved of Roman Catholicism and 19th-century evangelicalism, regarding both as extremes of Christianity and liable to limit personal expression. He was critical of what he considered as the hypocrisy of religious institutions and beliefs like spiritualism. all of which he considered aberrations from the real spirit of Christianity, as evidenced by the book he penned for his family in 1846. While Dickens pushed for equal rights for Catholics in England, he was deeply concerned about how individual civil liberties were frequently jeopardized in nations where Catholicism predominated, referring to the Catholic Church as that curse upon the world. Dickens also rejected evangelicals' belief that the Bible was God's authoritative message. His views on biblical interpretation were similar to those of liberal Anglican Arthur Pennerhan Stanley, who advocated progressive revelation. Dickens was described as that great Christian writer by Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky. Middle years. In December 1845, Dickens became editor of the London-based Daily News, a liberal paper through which he aimed to champion, in his own words, the principles of progress and improvement, of education, civil and religious liberty and equal legislation. Dickens picked other authors for the paper, including radical economist Thomas Hodgkin and social reformer Douglas William Gerald, who frequently criticized the Corn Laws. Dickens resigned after barely 10 weeks on the job, citing weariness and discontent with one of the paper's co-owners. Dickens, a Francophile, frequently vacationed in France and referred to the French as the first people in the universe in a French-language speech given in Paris in 1846. During his journey to Paris, Dickens met French writers Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, Eugene Scribe, Théophile Gautier, François-René de Chateaubriand, and Eugene Sue. In early 1849, Dickens began writing David Copperfield. It appeared between 1849 and 1850. In Dickens' biography, Life of Charles Dickens, 1872, John Forster wrote of David Copperfield, underneath the fiction lay something of the author's life. It was Dickens' particular favorite of his works, as stated in the author's foreword to the 1867 version. Dickens relocated to Tavistock House in late November 1851, where he authored Bleak House, 1852-53, Hard Times, 1854, and Little Dorrit, 1856. It was here that he participated in the amateur theatricals mentioned in Forster's Life of Charles Dickens. During this time, he collaborated closely with novelist and playwright Wilkie Collins. In 1856, his literary income enabled him to purchase Gadshill Place in Higham, Kent. As a child, Dickens had wandered past the mansion and fantasized about living there. The location was also the setting for some of Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1, and he enjoyed the literary connection. During this period, Dickens was also the publisher, editor, and primary contributor to the periodicals Household Words, 1850 to 1859, and All the Year Round, 1858 to 1870. Dickens brutally attacked Arctic explorer John Ray in Household Words in 1854, at the request of Sir John Franklin's widow Lady Jane, for reporting to the Admiralty that members of Franklin's lost expedition had resorted to cannibalism based on interviews with local Inuit. These assaults would subsequently be expounded on in his 1856 drama The Frozen Deep, a satire of Ray and the Inuit. Archaeological study on King William Island in the 20th century confirmed that members of the Franklin expedition engaged in cannibalism. Dickens' good friend and Liberal MP Austin Henry Layard founded the Administrative Reform Association in 1855 to seek fundamental parliamentary reforms, and Dickens joined and contributed his resources to promote Layard's cause. With the exception of Lord John Russell, the only major politician in whom Dickens had any faith and to whom he eventually dedicated A Tale of Two Cities, Dickens saw the political elite and their incompetence as England's downfall. When he and Layard were accused of inciting class conflict, Dickens responded that the classes were already at odds, and the fault lay with the aristocratic elite. Dickens utilized his pulpit in Household Words to promote the Reform Association. He also commented on foreign affairs, declaring his support for Giuseppe Garibaldi and Giuseppe Mazzini, assisting in the fundraising for their campaigns, and stating that the United Italy would be of vast importance to the peace of the world, and would be a rock in Louis Napoleon's way, and that, I feel for Italy almost as if I were an Italian born. Dickens also published dozens of pro-vaccine articles in Household Words, including several laudations for vaccine pioneer Edward Jenner. Following the Indian Mutiny of 1857, Dickens joined the widespread criticism of the East India Company for its role in the event, but reserved his rage for Indians, wishing to be the commander-in-chief in India so that he could do my utmost to exterminate the race upon whom the stain of the late cruelties rested. Dickens and his protégé Wilkie Collins wrote The Frozen Deep, for which he engaged professional actresses in 1857. Dickens fell in love with one of the actresses, Ellen Ternan, and the affection would last the rest of his life. Divorce would have been disgraceful for a celebrity like Dickens in 1858, when he was 45 and Ternan was 18. Dickens attempted to institutionalize Catherine after publicly accusing her of not loving their children and having a mental disorder, remarks that shocked his peers, including Elizabeth Barrett Browning. When his scheme failed, they split. Catherine went, never to see her husband again, taking with her only child. Her sister Georgina, who remained at Gad's Hill, raised the remaining children. During this time, Dickens was considering a scheme to offer public readings for profit when he was approached by Great Ormond Street Hospital via a philanthropic plea to assist it survive its first serious financial crisis. His Drooping Buds essay, published in Household Words on April 3, 1852, was regarded by the hospital's founders as the trigger for its development. Dickens, a well-known philanthropist, was requested by his friend, the hospital's founder Charles West, to preside over the appeal, and he put himself into it wholeheartedly. Dickens' public readings earned enough money for an endowment to put the hospital on solid financial footing. One reading alone on February 9, 1858, raised £3,000. After parting from Catherine, Dickens embarked on a series of popular and lucrative reading tours that, along with his journalism, would consume the most of his creative energies for the following decade, during which he would publish only 2 books. His first reading tour, which spanned from April 1858 to February 1859, included 129 appearances in 49 places in England, Scotland, and Ireland. Dickens' lifelong passion with the theatrical world was reflected in the theatre scenes in Nicholas Nickleby, and he found solace in public readings. In 1866, he gave a series of public readings in England and Scotland, followed by more the next year in England and Ireland. Other books, like A Tale of Two Cities, 1859, and Great Expectations, 1861, were huge triumphs. A Tale of Two Cities, set in London and Paris, is his most well-known piece of historical fiction, with the famous opening statement, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." It is widely regarded as one of the best-selling novels of all time. Themes in Great Expectations include money, poverty, and love. And rejection, with the ultimate triumph of virtue over evil. In early September 1860, Dickens set fire to the majority of his mail in a field behind Gad's Hill, saving only business letters. The extent of their affair is unknown because Ellen Ternan burned all of his letters to her. In the 1930s, Thomas Wright stated that Ternan had unburdened herself to Canon Benham, giving credence to rumors that they were lovers. In an interview with writer Gladys Story before Dickens' death in 1929, his daughter, Kate Perugini, revealed that the two had a son who died in infancy. Story published her account in Dickens and Daughter, but no contemporaneous proof was provided. Dickens provided Ternan with an income after his death, allowing her to be financially independent. Claire Tomalin's book The Invisible Woman contends that Ternan secretly resided with Dickens during the last 13 years of his life. Simon Gray adapted the book into a play, Little Nell, and a 2013 film. Dickens' interest in the paranormal grew during this time, and he joined the Ghost Club as an early member. In June 1862, he was offered £10,000 for a reading tour around Australia. He was enthused and even planned to write a travel book, The Uncommercial Traveller Upside Down, but eventually opted against the tour. 2 of his sons, Alfred Dorsey Tennyson Dickens and Edward Bulwer Lytton Dickens, emigrated to Australia, with Edward serving in the New South Wales Parliament as member for Wilcannia from 1889 to 1894. Later life. Dickens was engaged in a rail collision in Staplehurst, Kent, on his way back from Paris with Ellen Ternan on June 9, 1865. The train's first 7 carriages went off a cast-iron bridge that was being repaired, killing 10 passengers. Dickens was traveling on the sole first-class carriage that remained on the track, dangling precariously off the bridge. Dickens treated and comforted the wounded and dying for 3 hours before rescuers arrived, using a flask of brandy and a water-filled cap. Before departing, he remembered the incomplete manuscript for our mutual friend and went back to his carriage to grab it. Dickens later used the catastrophe as inspiration for his short ghost story, The Signalman, in which the protagonist character foresees his own death in a rail crash. He also based the novel on several previous rail catastrophes, including the Clayton Tunnel rail crash in Sussex in 1861. Dickens avoided attending the inquiry to avoid revealing that he had been traveling with Ternan and her mother, which would have produced a scandal. Dickens became cautious about taking the train after the accident and would choose alternative modes of transportation whenever possible. As early as 1868, he wrote, "I have sudden vague rushes of terror, even when riding in a hansom cab, which are perfectly unreasonable but quite insurmountable." Dickens' son, Henry, observed, "I've seen him occasionally in a railway carriage when there was a slight jolt. When this happened, he nearly panicked and grasped the seat with both hands." Second trip to the United States. While planning a second trip to the United States, the advent of the Civil War in America in 1861 pushed his plans back. On November 9, 1867, more than 2 years after the war, Dickens set off from Liverpool on his second American reading tour. After arriving in Boston, he spent the rest of the month attending dinners with notables like as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and his American publisher, James T. Fields. In early December, the readings started. Between December 1867 and April 1868, he did 76 readings and earned £19,000. Dickens traveled between Boston and New York, where he performed 22 readings at Steinway Hall. Despite suffering from what he referred to as true American catarrh, he maintained a schedule that would have tested a much younger man, even fitting in some slang in Central Park. During his travels, he noticed a shift in the people and circumstances of America. On April 18, he made his final appearance at an American press gala in his honor at Delmonico's, where he swore never to condemn America again. Dickens could barely eat solid food by the conclusion of the tour, relying on champagne and sherry-soaked eggs. On April 23, he boarded the Cunard liner Russia to return to Britain, narrowly avoiding a federal tax levy on the revenues of his lecture tour. Farewell readings. On October 6, 1868, Dickens began a series of farewell readings throughout England, Scotland, and Ireland. He completed 75 of the 100 readings he was contracted to conduct throughout the provinces, with another 12 in London. As he continued, he experienced giddiness and spells of paralysis. He suffered a stroke on April 18, 1869, in Chester. On April 22, 1869, he collapsed at Preston, Lancashire, and the trip was cancelled on doctor's advice. After subsequent regional readings were cancelled, he began writing his final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. It was trendy to do the slums in the 1860s, and Dickens visited opium dens in Shadwell with a friend, where he met an elderly addict named Lasker Sal, who served as the model for Opium Sal in Edwin Drood. After regaining strength, Dickens organized, with medical consent, for a last series of readings to partially compensate his sponsors for the loss caused by his illness. There were 12 performances from January 11 to March 15, 1870, the last at 8 p.m. in St. James's Hall, London. Despite his poor health at the time, he read A Christmas Carol and Pickwick's The Trial. On May 2, he made his final public appearance at a Royal Academy supper in front of the Prince and Princess of Wales, paying respect to his friend, illustrator Daniel Maclise, who had died. Death. Dickens suffered another stroke at home on June 8, 1870, after working all day on Edwin Drood. He never recovered consciousness. The next day, he died in Gadshill Place. According to biographer Claire Tomalin, Dickens was in Peckham when he suffered the stroke, and his mistress Ellen Ternan and her servants had him returned to Gadshill so that the public would not learn the truth about their connection. He was buried in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, contrary to his request to be buried in an inexpensive, unostentatious, and strictly private manner at Rochester Cathedral. The printed epitaph that circulated during the funeral reads, "To the memory of Charles Dickens, England's most renowned author, who died on June 9, 1870, at his home in Higham, near Rochester, Kent, at the age of 58. He was sympathetic to the poor, the suffering, and the oppressed, and his passing has left the world without one of England's finest writers." A letter from Dickens to the clerk of the Privy Council in March shows that he was offered and accepted a baronetcy, but it was not gazetted before his death. His final words were "on the ground," in answer to his sister-in-law Georgina's suggestion that he lie down. On Sunday, June 19, 1870, 5 days after Dickens was buried in the Abbey, Dean Arthur Pennerhan Stanley presented a memorial elegy, lauding the amiable and loving humorist whom we now mourn for demonstrating by his own example that even in dealing with the worst events, even in the most degraded individuals, intellect may be pure, and merriment could be innocent. Pointing to the fresh flowers on the novelist's tomb, Stanley told those in attendance that the spot would thenceforth be a sacred one with both the New World and the Old, as that of the representative of literature, not of this island only, but of all who speak our English tongue. Dickens' will, drafted more than a year before his death, left his £80,000 estate, £8,143,500 in 2021, to his longtime colleague John Forster and his best and truest friend Georgina Hogarth, who, along with Dickens' 2 sons, received a tax-free sum of £8,000. He approved his wife Catherine's annual stipend of £600, £61,100 in 2021. He bequeathed £19.19, £2,000 in 2021, to each servant he employed at the time of his death. Literary style. Dickens' approach to the book was influenced by a variety of factors, including the picaresque novel tradition, melodrama, and the novel of sensibility. Ackroyd believes that, aside from these, the Arabian Nights stories had the greatest significant literary influence on him. The picaresque narrative relies heavily on satire and ironic language. Comedy is also a part of the British picaresque novel tradition, which includes Lawrence Sterne, Henry Fielding, and Tobias Smollett. Fielding's Tom Jones had a significant impact on 19th-century novelists, including Dickens, who read it in his youth and named his son Henry Fielding Dickens after him. Dickens was influenced by Gothic literature, a literary genre that began with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, 1764. He infused Gothic imagery, settings, and story elements into his writings. Victorian Gothic expanded from castles and abbeys to modern metropolitan contexts, particularly London, as shown in Dickens' Oliver Twist and Bleak House. Miss Havisham, the jilted bride from Great Expectations, is one of Dickens' most well-known Gothic creations. She lives in a destroyed mansion, and her bridal gown essentially serves as her funeral shroud. William Shakespeare influenced Dickens more than any other writer. Alfred Harbidge argued in A Kind of Power, the Shakespeare-Dickens analogy, 1975, that no one is better qualified to recognize literary genius than a literary genius, in response to Dickens' admiration for Shakespeare. Dickens' lifelong love with Shakespeare included witnessing theatrical productions of his plays in London and putting on amateur dramatics with friends in his early years. He regarded Shakespeare as the great master whose plays were an unspeakable source of delight. Dickens visited Stratford-upon-Avon in 1838 and signed the Visitor's Book at Shakespeare's birthplace. Dickens would use this experience in his next novel, Nicholas Nickleby, 1838-39, to express the intensity of emotion felt by visitors to Shakespeare's birthplace. The character Mrs. Whitterly says, "I don't know how it is, but after you've seen the place and written your name in the little book, somehow or other you seem to be inspired. It kindles up quite a fire within one." Dickens' writing style is distinguished by its extensive linguistic originality. His specialty is satire, which he excels at through his ability to caricature. An early reviewer compared him to Hogarth for his deep practical grasp of the absurd side of reality, while his vaunted mastery of various forms of class vocabulary may reflect the traditions of contemporary popular theatre. Dickens worked hard to create memorable names for his characters that would evoke connections for his readers and aid in the development of motifs in the storyline, giving the novel's meanings an allegorical impetus, according to one critic. To mention one of many examples, the term Mr. Murdstone in David Copperfield conjures up images of murder and stony coldness. His literary style is a combination of imagination and realism. His satires of British aristocratic snobbery, he refers to one character as that noble refrigerator, are frequently successful. Dickens' famous flights of fancy include comparing orphans to stocks and shares, persons to tugboats, and dinner party guests to furniture. On his ability to elicit a response from his works, English screenwriter Sarah Phelps writes, "He knew how to work an audience and get them laughing their heads off one minute or on the edge of their seats and holding their breath the next." The second thing about Dickens was that he enjoyed telling stories and he adored his characters, especially the nasty, mean-spirited ones. The author collaborated closely with his illustrators, providing them with an overview of the job at the start to ensure that his characters and locations were exactly as he envisioned them. He provided the illustrator with plans for each month's installment so that work could begin before he wrote them. Marcus Stone, artist of Our Mutual Friend, said that the author was always ready to describe down to the minutest details the personal characteristics and life history of the creations of his fancy. Dickens uses Cockney English in many of his books to describe working-class Londoners. Cockney grammar is used in expressions like ain't, and consonants in words are commonly removed, as in here, and what. Oliver Twist serves as an illustration of this usage. The Artful Dodger used Cockney slang, which contrasts with Oliver's perfect English, when the Dodger replaces Oliver's seven with sivin. Characters. Dickens' biographer, Claire Tomalin, sees him as the greatest character builder in English fiction after Shakespeare. Dickensian characters are some of the most remembered in English literature, because to their generally funny names. The characters include Ebenezer Scrooge, Tiny Tim, Jacob Marley, and Bob Cratchit in A Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, The Artful Dodger, Fagin, and Bill Sikes in Oliver Twist, Pip, Miss Havisham, Estella, and Abel Magwitch in Great Expectations, Sidney Carton, Charles Darnay, and Madame Defarge in A Tale of Two Cities, David Copperfield, Uriah Heep, and Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield, Daniel Quilp and Nell Trent in The Old Curiosity Shop, and Samuel Pickwick and Sam Weller in The Pickwick Paper. His characters were frequently so unforgettable that they lived on beyond the pages of his works. Gamp became a slang phrase for an umbrella from the character Mrs. Gamp, and Pickwickian, Pecksniffian, and Gradgrind all entered dictionaries as a result of Dickens' original depictions of such individuals, who were quixotic, hypocritical, and vapidly factual. Sam Weller, Dickens' most famous character, is most renowned for his Wellerisms, one-liners that turn proverbs on their heads. Many were derived from real life. Mrs. Nickleby is based on his mother, but she did not recognize herself in the portrayal, and Mr. Micawber is constructed from features of his father's rhetorical exuberance. Harold Skimpole in Bleak House is based on James Henry Leigh Hunt, and his wife's dwarfish chiropodist recognized herself in Miss Mosher from David Copperfield. Perhaps Dickens' impressions of Hans Christian Andersen affected his portrayal of Uriah Heep, a name synonymous with sycophant. Virginia Woolf was of the opinion that we remodel our psychological geography when we read Dickens, in order to create characters who exist not in detail, not accurately or exactly, but abundantly in a cluster of wild yet extraordinarily revealing remarks. T.S. Eliot claimed that Dickens excelled in character, in the creation of characters of greater intensity than human beings. London is a character that he brilliantly depicts throughout his writings. Dickens described London as a magical light that inspired the settings and characters in many of his writings. From the coaching inns on the outskirts of the city to the lower reaches of the Thames, Dickens's London is detailed in detail throughout his book. Walking the streets, especially in London, was an important aspect of his creative life, stimulating his creativity. Dickens was known to walk at least a dozen miles, 19 kilometers, each day and once stated, "If I couldn't walk fast and far, I should just explode and perish." Autobiographical components. Authors frequently sketch images of characters based on persons they know in real life. Many see David Copperfield as Dickens' veiled autobiography. The settings in Bleak House depict long court trials and legal discussions, reflecting Dickens' experiences as a law clerk and court reporter, particularly his direct experience with the law's procedural delays in 1844, when he sued publishers in Chancery for copyright infringement. Dickens' father was imprisoned for debt, and this became a recurring motif in several of his works, including the comprehensive account of life in the Marshalsea jail in Little Dorrit, which sprang from Dickens' personal experiences there. Lucy Strughill, a childhood sweetheart, may have influenced some of Dickens' depictions of females, including Little Emily in David Copperfield and Lucy Minette in A Tale of Two Cities. Dickens may have reflected on his boyhood memories, but he was also ashamed of them and refused to admit that this was where he got his realistic depictions of misery. Few people knew about Dickens' early life until 6 years after his death, when John Forster published a biography on which he had cooperated. Though Skimpole viciously mocks Leigh Hunt, some critics have found elements of Dickens' own nature in his picture, which he attempted to exorcise through self-parody. Episodic writing. Dickens, a pioneer in the serial production of narrative fiction, wrote the majority of his major novels in monthly or weekly installments in journals such as Master Humphrey's Clock and Household Words, which were eventually reissued as books. These installments made the stories more affordable and accessible, and the audience was more evenly spread across economic levels than before. His installment approach sparked a story that he would continue to explore and expand throughout his career, and the recurring cliffhangers made each new episode much anticipated. When The Old Curiosity Shop was serialized, American fans gathered at the piers in New York Harbor, shouting to the crew of an arriving British ship, "Is Little Nell dead?" Dickens managed to utilize this episodic writing technique while still producing a coherent work at the end. Another significant consequence of Dickens' episodic writing approach was his exposure to the opinions of his readers and acquaintances. His friend Forster had a significant influence on his drafts. Going beyond punctuation, he toned down melodramatic and sensationalist exaggerations, cut long passages, such as Quilp's drowning in The Old Curiosity Shop, and made plot and character suggestions. He urged that Charlie Bates be redeemed in Oliver Twist. Dickens had not considered killing Little Nell, and Forster told him to consider this possibility as part of his heroine notion. Dickens was at the forefront of popularizing cliffhangers and serial publications in Victorian literature, and his influence can also be seen in television soap operas and film series, with The Guardian stating that the DNA of Dickens is busy, episodic storytelling, delivered in installments and rife with cliffhangers and diversions, is traceable in everything. Other writers responded to his novel serialization. In Scottish novelist Robert Louis Stevenson's work The Wrecker, Captain Nares, when exploring an abandoned ship, said, "See." They were writing up the log, Nares explained, pointing to the ink bottle. "I was caught napping, like I always do. I wonder whether there has ever been a captain who lost a ship while keeping his logbook up to date. He usually has about a month to fill in on a clean break, similar to Charles Dickens and his serial books." Social commentary. Dickens' novels, among other things, served as social commentary. Simon Callow puts it this way: from the moment he started to write, he spoke for the people, and the people loved him for it. He was an outspoken critic of Victorian poverty and social hierarchy. In a speech in New York, he stated that virtue shows quite as well in rags and patches as she does in purple and fine linen. Dickens' second novel, Oliver Twist, 1839, stunned readers with its depictions of poverty and crime. It contradicted middle-class polemics about criminals, making it hard to pretend ignorance about what poverty entailed. At a time when Britain was the world's leading economic and political force, Dickens focused on the lives of society's neglected poor and underprivileged. He campaigned on specific topics through his journalism, such as sanitation and the workhouse, but his fiction was most effective in shaping public opinion on class inequities. He frequently represented poor exploitation and tyranny, condemning governmental authorities and institutions that not only tolerated but thrived on such atrocities. Dickens' most vehement condemnation of this state comes in Hard Times, 1854, his only novel-length depiction of the industrial working class. In this piece, he used anger and humor to demonstrate how this marginalized socioeconomic strata was named hands by the factory owners, that is, not really people, but rather merely appendages. His ideas inspired others, particularly journalists and politicians, to address issues of class injustice. For example, it is said that the prison scenes in the Pickwick Papers influenced the closure of the Fleet Prison. Dickens, according to Karl Marx, issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together. George Bernard Shaw even claimed that Great Expectations was more seditious than Marx's Das Kapital. The great popularity of Dickens' novels, especially those with socially opposing themes, Bleak House, 1853, Little Dorrit, 1857, Our Mutual Friend, 1865, not only demonstrated his ability to generate fascinating narratives and unforgettable characters, however, it also forced the Victorian people to confront hitherto overlooked questions of social fairness. It has been stated that his technique of flooding his narratives with an unruly superfluity of material that, in the eventual denouement, gives an unexpected order, impacted the organization of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Literary techniques. Dickens is frequently described as using idealized characters and very romantic moments to contrast with his caricatures and the bleak socio-economic truths he exposes. Contemporary readers found Nell Trent's story in The Old Curiosity Shop, 1841, to be immensely poignant, while Oscar Wilde thought it was ludicrously saccharine. One must have a heart of stone to read The Death of Little Nell, he observed famously, without dissolving into tears of laughter. G. K. Chesterton stated, "It is not the death of Little Nell, but the life of Little Nell, that I object to," arguing that the maudlin effect of his description of her life owed much to the gregarious nature of Dickens's grief, as well as his despotic use of people's feelings to move them to tears in works like this. The question of whether Dickens belongs to the sentimental novel tradition is controversial. In her book Dickens and the Sentimental Tradition, Valerie Pettin sees him as maintaining features of this tradition, arguing that his sentimental scenes. Dickens paints an idealized portrayal of a youngster whose morals are never undermined by violent orphanages or coerced engagement in a gang of young pickpockets. While later works also have idealized characters, Esther Summerson in Bleak House and Amy Dorrit in Little Dorrit, their idealism serves simply to emphasize Dickens' purpose of poignant societal satire. Dickens' work, which reflects what he felt to be true about his own life, makes extensive use of coincidence, either for humorous effect or to stress the concept of providence. For example, Oliver Twist reveals himself to be the upper-class family's long-lost nephew, who saves him from the pickpockets. Such coincidences are common in 18th-century picaresque books, including Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, which Dickens adored as a child. Reputation. Dickens was the most famous novelist of his time and is now one of the most well-known and widely read English authors. His books have never gone out of print and have been adapted for the screen since the creation of cinema, with at least 200 film and television adaptations based on Dickens' work documented. Many of his novels were adapted for the stage during his lifetime, including The Haunted Man, which premiered in the West End's Adelphi Theatre in 1848, and Walter R. Booth's British silent picture Scrooge, or Marley's Ghost, which was released in 1901. Contemporaries, such as publisher Edward Lloyd, capitalized on Dickens' popularity by producing cheap imitations of his novels, culminating in his own successful Penny Dreadfuls. Dickens created some of the world's most famous fictional characters, and he is often recognized as the finest British novelist of the Victorian era. From the start of his career in the 1830s, his contributions to English literature were likened to those of Shakespeare. Dickens' literary reputation, however, began to dwindle with the publication of Bleak House in 1852-53. Philip Collins describes Bleak House as a critical item in the history of Dickens' reputation. During the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s, reviewers and literary leaders witnessed a drear decline in Dickens, from a writer of bright sunny humor, to gloomy and serious social commentary. The Spectator labeled Bleak House a heavy book to read through at once, dull and wearisome as a serial. Richard Simpson in The Rambler described Hard Times as this dreary framework, and Fraser's magazine said Little Dorrit was decidedly the worst of his novels. Despite these increasing reservations amongst reviewers and the chattering classes, the public never deserted its favorite. Dickens' popular reputation remained intact, sales continued to climb, and household words and, later, all the year round were huge successes. Dickens' renown and demand for his public readings grew exponentially throughout his tenure. In 1868, the Times observed, amid all the variety of readings, those of Mr. Charles Dickens stand alone. In the 1950s, Edgar Johnson, Dickens' biographer, wrote, "It was, always, more than a reading, it was an extraordinary exhibition of acting that seized upon its auditors with a mesmeric possession." Juliet Johns supported Dickens' claim to be the first self-made global media star of the age of mass culture. The Guardian compares his reception at public readings to that of a contemporary pop artist, writing, "People sometimes collapsed at his appearances." His performances even saw the emergence of the current phenomena known as the speculator or ticket tout, scalpers, who in New York City evaded discovery by borrowing respectable-looking hats from waiters at neighboring restaurants. Fellow writers had varying perspectives on Dickens. Poet laureate William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850, described Dickens as a very talkative, vulgar young person, adding that he had not read a line of his writing. Novelist George Meredith, 1828 to 1909, deemed Dickens intellectually lacking. In 1888, Leslie Stevens stated in the Dictionary of National Biography that if literary reputation could be securely assessed by appeal among the half-educated, Dickens must hold the highest rank among English novelists. Anthony Trollope's autobiography famously declared Thackeray, not Dickens, to be the best novelist of the day. However, Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky were enthusiasts. Dostoevsky stated, "We understand Dickens in Russia, I am persuaded, almost as well as the English, possibly even with all the nuances. It is possible that we love him just as much as his compatriots. And yet, Dickens is so original and very English." Tolstoy regarded David Copperfield as his favorite book, and he later used the novel as a model for his own autobiographical reflections. French writer Jules Verne called Dickens his favorite writer, saying that his novels stand alone, dwarfing all others by their amazing power and felicity of expression. Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh drew inspiration from Dickens' novels in several of his works, including Vincent's Chair, and declared in an 1889 letter to his sister that reading Dickens, particularly A Christmas Carol, was one of the things stopping him from committing himself. Oscar Wilde typically disliked his portrayal of characters, but admired his talent at caricature. Henry James dismissed him as the greatest of superficial novelists, claiming that Dickens' characters lacked psychological depth and that his novels were loose baggy monsters that indicated a cavalier organization. Joseph Conrad depicted his own youth in grim Dickensian terms, stating that he had an intense and unreasoning affection for Grimhouse extending back to his infancy. In The Secret Agent, 1907, Virginia Woolf found Dickens' novels mesmerizing, but criticized his sentimentalism and commonplace style. However, literary critics began to warm up to Dickens around 1940 to 41, led by George Orwell in Inside the Whale and Other Essays, March 1940, Edmund Wilson in The Wound and the Bough, 1941, and Humphrey House in Dick. Dickens was indeed a great genius, but the genius was that of a great entertainer, though he later changed his mind with Dickens the Novelist, 1970, with Q. D. Queenie, Levis. Our purpose, they wrote, is to enforce as unquestionably as possible the conviction that Dickens was one of the greatest of creative writers. Sergei Eisenstein, a Soviet film director and film theorist, authored an essay in 1944 about Dickens' influence on cinema, including cross-cutting, which occurs when two episodes run concurrently, as seen in novels like Oliver Twist. In the mid-1950s, a substantial reassessment and re-editing of the works began, and critics found his finest artistry and greatest depth to be in the later novels, Bleak House, Little Dorrit, and Great Expectations, and, less unanimously, In Hard Times and Our Mutual Friend. Roald Dahl adored Dickens, and 3 of his writings were read by the titular character in his 1988 novel Matilda. In 2005, Paul McCartney, an enthusiastic Dickens reader, declared Nicholas Nickleby his favorite novel. On Dickens, he says, "I like the world he takes me to. I like his phrases, I enjoy the vocabulary," adding, "A lot of my stuff is Dickensian." Jonathan Nolan's screenplay for The Dark Knight Rises, 2012, was influenced by A Tale of Two Cities, with Nolan describing the novel's depiction of Paris, one of the most harrowing portraits of a relatable, recognizable civilization that completely folded to pieces. On February 7, 2012, the 200th anniversary of Dickens' birth, Philip Womack wrote in The Telegraph, "Today there is no escaping Charles Dickens. That has never been a likely scenario in the past. He has a strong, unusual hold on us." Legacy. Many of the sites where Dickens lived and worked have museums and festivals dedicated to his life and works. These include the Charles Dickens Museum in London, which is the historic home where he penned Oliver Twist, The Pickwick Papers, and Nicholas Nickleby, as well as the Charles Dickens Birthplace Museum in Portsmouth, where he was born. The Victoria and Albert Museum houses original manuscripts for several of Dickens' works, as well as printers' proofs, first editions, and pictures from his friend John Forster's collection. Dickens will specify that no memorial be erected in his honor. However, a life-size bronze statue of Dickens named Dickens and Little Nell, created in 1890 by Francis Edwin Elwell, stands in Clark Park, Philadelphia's Spruce Hill neighborhood. Another life-size statue of Dickens can be found in Sydney, Australia's Centennial Park. In 1960, sculptor Escart J. Clack was commissioned to create a bas-relief sculpture of Dickens, particularly depicting characters from his writings, for the office building built on the site of his former residence at 1 Devonshire Terrace, London. On the 202nd anniversary of his birth, a life-size statue was unveiled near his birthplace in Portsmouth. Ian and Gerald Dickens, his great-great-grandsons, contributed to the project. A Christmas Carol is undoubtedly his most well-known story, with numerous fresh adaptations. It is also the most often filmed of Dickens' stories, with several adaptations dating back to the early days of cinema. According to historian Ronald Hutton, the current level of Christmas observance stems largely from a mid-Victorian resurgence of the festival led by A Christmas Carol. Dickens catalyzed the growing Christmas as a family-centered festival of generosity, in contrast to the diminishing community-based and church-centered traditions, as new middle-class expectations emerged. Its archetypal characters, Scrooge, Tiny Tim, and the Christmas ghosts, entered Western cultural consciousness. "Merry Christmas," a memorable phrase from the narrative, gained popularity after its publication. The moniker Scrooge became synonymous with miser, and his exclamation, "Bah! Humbug," which dismissed the celebratory spirit, became an idiom. The Victorian novelist William Makepeace Thackeray described the work as a national benefit, and to every man and woman who reads it a personal kindness. Dickens was remembered on the Bank of England Series E £10 note, which circulated from 1992 to 2003. His portrait featured on the reverse of the note, along with a vignette from the Pickwick Papers. Charles Dickens School is a high school in Broadstairs, Kent. Dickens World, a theme park that opened in Chatham in 2007 and was partially built on the site of the former Navy dockyard where Dickens' father worked in the Navy Pay Office, closed on October 12, 2016. To commemorate Charles Dickens' 200th birthday in 2012, the Museum of London hosted the UK's first major exhibition on the author in 40 years. Dickens was ranked 41st out of the 100 Greatest Britons by the BBC in 2002. American literary scholar Harold Bloom ranked Dickens among the best Western writers of all time. 5 of Dickens' books made the top 100 of the BBC's 2003 UK survey The Big Red. Anthony Hopkins, Derek Jacobi, Simon Callow, Dan Stevens, and Ralph Fiennes have all played Dickens on film, with the latter portraying the author in The Invisible Woman, 2013, which depicts Dickens' alleged 13-year secret love affair with Ellen Ternan before his death in 1870. Dickens and his publications have appeared on a number of postage stamps in countries including the United Kingdom, 1970, 1993, 2011, and 2012 issued by the Royal Mail. Their 2012 collection marked the bicentenary of Dickens's birth. The Soviet Union, 1962, Antigua, Barbuda, Botswana, Cameroon, Dubai, Fujairah, St. Lucia and Turks and Caicos Islands, 1970, St. Vincent, 1987, Nevis, 2007, Alderney, Gibraltar, Jersey, and Pitcairn Islands, 2012, Austria, 2013, and Mosa. In 1976, a crater on Mercury was named in his honor. In November 2018, it was revealed that Margaret Gillies' previously lost portrait of a 31-year-old Dickens was discovered in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa. Gillies, an early supporter of women's suffrage, created the portrait in late 1843, when Dickens, then 31, penned A Christmas Carol. It was shown to great success at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1844. The Charles Dickens Museum is said to have paid £180,000 for the portrait. Dear viewers, we greatly appreciate your time and support in watching our video. If you found it amusing or instructive, please consider subscribing to our channel. Subscribing not only shows your support for our work, but also allows you to become an active member of our growing YouTube community. In addition to subscribing, remember to enable the notification bell icon. This means you'll be among the first to know when we release new videos. Being a member of our notification squad ensures that you do not miss any great changes or announcements. Your subscription and participation mean everything to us. It encourages us to keep generating high-quality content that entertains, informs, and inspires. We really appreciate each and every one of you for choosing to join our YouTube family. As we travel together, we vow to provide more engaging and insightful content that speaks to your interests. We value your opinions and recommendations, so please share them with us in the comments area. Thank you again for your unwavering support. We're thrilled to have you join us on this trip. Until our next video, take care, stay tuned, and remember that we can all make a difference. See you soon.